All right. Good afternoon. Well, good evening, everybody. It's so wonderful to see so many of you coming out to join us for this very important opportunity that we have for Holocaust education. I'm Sarah Gottwald, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Committee. It's a very big mouthful, but presentation. Excellent. So it's important that we hear as many survivors as we possibly can for multiple reasons. One, just because you've heard one story doesn't mean that you've heard all stories, right? I'm sure any of you who've heard more than one story can fully agree with that. But secondly, there are a lot of Holocaust deniers. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, unfortunately, in this country. So it's important that we hear stories like Steen so that we can be the upstanders, so that we can stand up against Holocaust deniers and say, no, you are wrong. The Holocaust happened. I heard someone's story. I shook their hand. I met them. I saw them, whatever the case may be, right? We have lots of their testimonies, and it's up to us to carry these forward into the future. So all that Steen's going to ask of you tonight is that you keep his story alive, that you continue to share his story. These people aren't going to be with us very much longer. You know, it's not forever, unfortunately. And as much as I would love to still have Steen in 50 years, I don't know if I'm going to be here in 50 years. But it's wonderful to have Steen tonight presenting to us. You always come out, you always do such a wonderful presentation for all of our students. We really appreciate that. Our students appreciate that. And thank you so much for all that you do for Holocaust education, Steen. So as Steen shares his story with you, please jot down any questions that you may have for him so that you can ask him at the end of the presentation, at the end of the lecture. He loves questions. And this is, once again, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This is a real live Holocaust survivor that you can speak with. So Steen is going to be sharing his story with us tonight of his life as a young Danish survivor of the Holocaust. And without further ado, I present to you Mr. Steen Metz.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate it. And good afternoon, everyone. I want to start off by relating a story from one of my presentations to a middle school after the program. And it's very similar to what I'm talking about tonight. An 8th grader came up to me and asked, do you feel guilty or lucky being alive? First of all, I thought that was a very deep question from an 8th grader. And I would answer it the same way today. Maybe I should feel guilty, but first of all, I feel very lucky. And it may be strange to you, since I'm a Holocaust survivor, saying I was lucky. But can you imagine, I was in a camp and we had about 15,000 children, less than 1,200, less than 10% survived, and I was one of them. In many ways, I feel it's my responsibility to carry forward the message that about 6 million Jewish people perished during the Holocaust, and they're not able to carry the message forward. And I believe sincerely that I'm representing them. Whenever I talk, I ask each person to be my ambassador, talk to at least 4 people, tell them you know that the Holocaust took place. Why is that so important? For one simple reason. It's a long time since the Holocaust occurred. Some people are unfortunately forgetting it. Even worse, anti-Semitism is on the rise, not only all over the United States, but in Europe as well. In addition to that, there are actually people today that are denying that the Holocaust ever took place. I realize that I'm not totally objective, but how can anybody deny that it ever took place? I want to start with the next slide, which shows a copy of my book, A Danish Boy in Theresienstadt, Reflections of a Holocaust Survivor. The book was published in the fall of 2011, and it was updated about 3 years ago. Not only was it updated, but I added a number of chapters. There was only one reason why I wrote the book, I wanted future generations always to remember that the Holocaust took place. On the next slide, I'm showing a map of Denmark. Goes back a long, long time. April the 9th, 1940. I wasn't even 5 years old at the time. And I remember it very, very clearly. I'll never forget the sound, the horrible sound of the German airplanes flying very, very low. In many instances, I thought they would tear some roofs off, but they didn't. That was the day that Hitler and the Nazis occupied Denmark by land, by sea, and by air. The occupation turned out to last a little over 5 years. When I look back, I should mention that there wasn't much of a battle going on. The Danes surrendered for one simple reason. They had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. It didn't mean anything for Hitler. We learned early on you couldn't trust the evil man. He had signed a similar agreement with about 20 other countries in Europe, and he occupied every single one of them. So when I look back, I'm absolutely amazed that the first 3 years were relatively, and I want to emphasize the word relatively normal in Denmark, certainly compared to what happened in the other occupied countries. The Nazis took over the government in the other 20 countries. Kings, queens, royalty escaped, some of them as far as to Canada, some of them to Great Britain. So why was it different in Denmark? In Denmark, the king continued to rule. The government continued to govern with some limitations. There are a number of reasons why it was different in Denmark, but I believe the major one is the fact that the Germans loved the Danish food, agricultural products like pork, salami, butter, cheese. We used to export it to Great Britain. That stopped immediately. We were ordered to send the food down to Germany. We fed the Germans in Germany. We fed the Nazis in Denmark. As a matter of fact, I read a book not too long ago, and one of the German soldiers said, "We just love being in Denmark because we love your food." I want to show you a picture of the king on the next slide. The king in his early 70s on his daily ride in support of the Danish people. 2 Nazi soldiers are saluting the king. The king hated the Nazis on purpose. He is looking straight forward. I want to go to the next picture, and I realize you can only see part of me, so you may not recognize that young fellow on the screen. Yes, it is me. It is yours truly. But there's a very, very important reason for sharing the picture with you. It's hard for me to imagine that we were able to go on vacation in the summer of 1943. The Germans occupied Denmark. They were literally at every street corner. I would run into them when I would bicycle to and from school every morning, every early afternoon. They never approached me. I couldn't understand their German, and they couldn't understand my Danish. But in the fall of 1943, conditions changed dramatically. Can we go back to the map a few slides ago? Thank you. A lot of young people, mostly college, university age, were not very happy that the Danes had surrendered so easily, and they formed a sabotage group in every single town you can see on the map. It had nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with the armed forces. It was ad hoc. It was completely independent, run by the young people. One of the more famous groups came out of my hometown in the middle of the map, Odense, with a red frame around it. That was called the Churchill Group. And I read a book about it not too long ago. And it were two high school brothers. Can you imagine, at high school age, they were part of a sabotage group, and they were both sent to jail by the Germans. They were on a dangerous mission. They stood up for what they thought were right. In my book, they were upstanders. And I'm big for the word upstanders as opposed to bystanders. There were too many bystanders during the Holocaust. And today we have a number of bystanders standing by, being indifferent, not being part of standing up for what they think is right. Their major mission, the saboteurs' major mission, was to prevent products, not only food, but anything manufactured in Denmark that we had to ship to Germany. They were so successful in the mission that the German commandant went to the Danish prime minister, said, this has to stop. You have to arrest the young people and you have to sentence them to death. There was no way the government would agree to do that. They resigned. A Danish administration took over. And this became what we call the final solution, the roundup of the Jewish people in Denmark. We had about 8,000 Jewish people, most of them living in the northeast around the area of Copenhagen and north and south of Copenhagen. There were very few Jewish people, as an example, in my hometown, Odense. So as a result, the commandant in Germany made a trip to Berlin, to headquarters, got permission to start arresting the Jewish people, went back to Copenhagen to start the final solution. Once again, there was a unique situation in Denmark. A leading German diplomat heard about the arrest date, relayed the word to the Danish administration. Word got around very, very fast among the Jewish population in Copenhagen. As a result, 7,500 Jewish people, or well over 90% of the total Danish Jewish population, managed to escape to Sweden. You can barely see Sweden in the creamy color. Sweden managed to be neutral during the Holocaust, and they opened up their borders not only for the Danish Jews, but also for some Norwegian Jews. Most of the Danes went to Sweden by fishing boat. I understand there were well over 600 transports, and you could see on the water the strait between Denmark and Sweden is very narrow, I believe about 2 or 3 miles in the narrowest place. My family lived, as I mentioned earlier, in the middle of the country. To my knowledge, we had not been alerted. And I need to remind you that communications in those days were quite different. We didn't have television. We certainly didn't have phones or iPhones. We relied on radio, newspaper, and telephone, and the Germans cut off the telephone lines in Denmark. As a result, one early morning, October 2nd, 1943, 2 Gestapo officers pounded on our door. We lived on the 3rd floor in an apartment. It was totally unexpected. My father answered the door. The family got about 45, 50 minutes to get ready. packing essential clothes. My mother and I were allowed to go down to the baker. He had a bakery on the first floor. On the ground floor, he gave us some rolls. He gave us some Danish pastry. We knew the baker very well. His children, I played with his children. And later on, I learned that he actually offered my mother that he thought he might be able to help us escape. But there was no way my mother could accept that. My father was up in the apartment, and he would probably have been shot on the spot if we had disappeared. If we can move forward a couple of slides. Thank you. The truck in the picture, we boarded the truck. They transported us into the middle of town at a schoolyard. There are about 60 Danes with their suitcases behind them, standing in the schoolyard. I think we were there for a couple of hours. This is a very, very unique artifact. It was taken by a man on the balcony, and he had actually put it away on the loft of his house, and it wasn't found until after he passed away, and it's been used on many, many occasions. We spent, I think, a couple of hours there. Then we were back in the truck, and we were transported to the western part of Denmark. And on the next slide, you'll see a cattle car. Some of you may have seen a similar cattle car. The neighbor's museum has a cattle car that are used for education purposes. And this one is very similar. Can you imagine spending well over 3 days, 3 nights in complete darkness, no lights, no windows, one door, it was locked from the outside, a lot of uncertainty. As an 8-year-old, I didn't quite understand what was going on. I certainly didn't understand why some of my family was not on board. But little by little, my parents tried to explain it to me, but it took a long time to sink in. I can still remember the faces, the frightened faces of the Jewish people in the cattle car. Can you imagine what my face, 8-year-old, was like? There were 3 other children who were able to lie down on a dirty floor. The rest of the people had to alternate between sitting and standing for well over 80 hours. We were not fed. The only food we got, some of the bakery products we had brought, we shared. Some people brought sandwiches, some people brought snacks, and we tried to share it. I don't think we knew anybody there. There was only one other family, a Jewish family, in Odense, and the couple was in the same cattle car as we were. The smell was getting worse and worse. We had no bathroom facilities. We used some buckets in the corner. We finally made a stop. But I have to tell you, not knowing what was going to happen to us, would we survive? Would we all be shot? Would we ever get any food? That was the worst part, the uncertainty. So we made a stop, got some fresh air, finally got something to drink, water. And then we arrived in the camp Tersen. On the next slide, Tersen is the Czech version. Czechoslovakia is the German version of a small town. It used to be a fortress and was then Czechoslovakia, today the Czech Republic, about 550 miles south of Denmark, about 40 miles north of Prague, the biggest city of Czechoslovakia. On the next slide, I'm showing some Jewish people walking from the station. At that time, we did not have a train station in the camp, and we had to walk for a couple of miles, and then the train station on the left. As soon as we arrived, the screaming Nazis ordered everyone to empty their pockets. They took our valuables, jewelry, money, some of the good clothes in our suitcases. Can you imagine? Most of the people, including my father, when we were arrested, were told, make sure you bring money, you'll be able to spend it. On the next slide, I'm showing a loft. It was broken into groups, women, men, children, seniors. My mother and I were able to stay together. We spent 18 long months in a loft, very similar to what you see here. There were probably about 80 to 90 people. It was very unique, and I want to emphasize that a child was able to stay with their mother. I have met other survivors, but I never heard anybody staying with their father. You can see we slept on bunk beds. It was very hot in the summer. I remember I would be scratching myself, fleas, lice. I had to ask my mother what was going on. It was very, not only in the heat or the cold weather, it was uncomfortable, but lying on basically wood was difficult to sleep, especially in the beginning. Yes, we had mattresses, but they were very thin. There was very little straw in them. So anybody being 16 years or older had to work. In other words, if you were 16 years or older, you were considered an adult. My father was an attorney. He was used to litigating in a courthouse, working in an office. And suddenly, in the middle of the winter, it was starting to snow. It was getting cold. And he had to do work outside and some heavy road work. Next slide, please. The more I think about it, the more unfortunate I think my father was. Why couldn't he have got a job inside? But he didn't. And you had no choice. Everybody had to work. It was very difficult for him to handle it because he wasn't used to that kind of work. On top of that, a young man told us that my father was literally whipped and kicked when he didn't perform the arbitrary goals set by the Nazis. He couldn't handle it. My mother told me he lost about half of his body weight. He ended up in infirmary. He spent a few months there. They had good help, nurses, doctors, but they didn't have the medical supplies. And my father passed away at a young age of 40. And he had been married to my mother for less than 9 years. Of course, the Germans told the world, so to speak, that my father died of pneumonia. They didn't want to tell anybody they died from hunger. Maybe we can just go back to the previous slide, if you may. Thank you. My mother, to my knowledge, was not physically abused like my father, but she was mentally abused on a number of occasions. Once, she worked with metal or something material that came from the mountains in the Czech Republic, but they used it for insulation material. There were about 200 or 300 women at workbenches in a huge factory, and they would file down the metal. And one day, at the end of the day, and there were long days, weekends, holidays included, an officer came in and asked a number of people how they felt. That included my mother. And my mother answered, "I don't feel so good." "Why is that?" she was asked. "I lost my husband." "How?" And my mother was very honest, and she said he died of hunger. The officer left shortly afterwards. All the women on the floor congregated around my mother and said, "You shouldn't have said that. You could have been shot." And my mother said, "But it was the truth." But you imagine the next 7 or 8 days, that same officer returned to the factory floor and asked my mother each time about my father. And now she had to say that he died of pneumonia. Being 8 years old, I didn't have to work. I did some voluntary work as a gopher, messenger, taking messages, taking documents from one German office to the other. I didn't want to spend too much time in each office. The Germans never approached me, but they looked pretty frightening in their, what I refer to as ugly green uniforms and their guns. I would do that job for a couple of hours in the morning, a couple of hours in the afternoon. And then one day on my way back to the barracks, I passed the kitchen. I saw some big sacks of raw potatoes at the end of the kitchen. Helped myself to a couple of raw potatoes, put them in my pocket, and my mother and I would share them later on. We needed all the help we could get. At breakfast, we would get about half a loaf of bread with some margarine. Had to last for the entire family for, I believe, a whole week. Then we got substitute coffee. Then at lunch, we would line up again. As you can see on the next slide, we lined up as some older people at the end of the line. Sometimes we had to wait up to 40 or 50 minutes. Didn't take a long time to serve lunch because we got potato soup every single day. I couldn't eat it the first couple of days. It didn't taste very good. And my mother would say, "Steen, you better eat it or you're not going to make it." That was the message I needed. And from then on, I had what they called potato soup, which basically consisted of boiled water and potato peel and potato skin. At dinner, we would line up once again. At least we would get different soups. At night, I remember beef, barley, and some others. A special treat once a week, dumplings, a typical German pasta dish. How were we able to survive on those meager portions? Can you imagine 35,000 inmates out of 140,000 passed away from hunger, most of them, just like my father? I believe the only reason I'm here in front of you, being able to share my experiences, is the fact that we started getting packages. All nations were allowed packages from their homeland. We had a tremendous support system in Sweden and Denmark, and we probably got more packages than anybody else. Clothing, vitamins, and food. Especially the food was very welcome. The packages started coming after we had been in camp for 6 months. It doesn't mean everybody got them in early April. It took a while to make the cycle. And I wish we had received the packages earlier. Maybe it would have saved my father. So one day my mother is opening a package. She doesn't understand why it's so heavy. No clothing, no food, no vitamins. When she opens the package, she finds 2 big bricks at the bottom of the package. That's why it was so heavy. I still wonder how one human being can treat another human being that way. Yes, the guards may not have got all the food they wanted, but they certainly got a lot more than we did. One other example from camp, I was by that time 9 years old, and I needed shoes. There was no way my mother was able to buy shoes anywhere, new shoes, I mean. She bartered with a Czech lady. The Czech lady got some Danish food, and my mother got some used shoes, and I was able to wear them the rest of the time in camp. Being 9 years old, I didn't realize it, but later on I heard the food was like gold in the camp. If you had food, you could get just about anything. I'm often asked, what did I do in camp other than lining up for food 3 times a day, working a couple hours in the morning, a couple hours in the afternoon? I played with other children. I especially remember playing with some Czech children. We tried to play soccer. We didn't have a real soccer field. The mothers took some old clothes, tied them together, and we kicked it around. Had a wonderful time until one day the boys, my friends, didn't show up. And I couldn't understand what had happened to them. Later on, I found out, next slide, please, those poor boys were among 85,000 inmates deported to extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. You can see a Gestapo officer overlooking the departure at the train station. It's amazing. I didn't know that it existed at that time. I think my mother didn't think it was necessary for me to know about it. It's my understanding the scenes at the station were just terrible. The men wanted to accompany their wives and vice versa. The parents wanted the children to stay behind because very few people survived the Auschwitz-Birkenau gas chambers. On the next slide, I went back to Terrassen, excuse me. Oh, I think it was around here, 2009. My wife was concerned that it would all come back to me, but I really wanted to see it as a free person. And I'm glad I did. And I saw a memorial, which here is in front of you, which doesn't mean much to you. But this memorial was erected later on the exact spot where a number of children, including myself, had been forced to form a chain. And we took the urns, they had paper cartons with the ashes in it, and we took that from the crematorium, and then it was eventually thrown into the river back. You could barely see the river behind the trees. There was a Danish boy, a couple of years older than me, who stood next to me, and I didn't find out until later that he turned the box so I wouldn't see the name or the number of my father. By the way, I'm often asked, do I have a tattooed number on my underarm? I don't. And it's a bit of a misconception because it's shown in so many videos and books, inmates with a tattoo. It's only, and I want to put only in quote, it's only the inmates who ended up in Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was close to 1.5 million, that have a tattoo on them. But anyway, I want to go to the next slide. I'm sure this doesn't look like a concentration camp to you. And that was exactly the goal of the Germans. The Danish administration wanted to see how the Danish prisoners were treated. Eventually, they were allowed to make a visit in June of 1944. Everybody was very busy painting buildings, putting products in the windows, installing new equipment, including sinks. They looked brand new. You couldn't use them. There was no plumbing. It was all for show, including the music pavilion you see, benches, grass, lawns. Can you believe they even imported some French children that played? They looked healthy because they had just arrived. The Danes were transferred to better and bigger quarters, so it didn't look so crowded. And eventually, the delegation arrived, I think it was June 24th, 1944. Red Cross from Denmark, Switzerland, and Germany. They didn't see the real camp. And I'm often asked, did you not talk to them about what happened? We couldn't. We didn't dare. We've been told anybody who opens their mouth will either be shot on the spot or more likely, since the delegation was there, more likely sent in transport. They returned to their home country, never seeing their real concentration camp. On the next slide, I refer to that as happiness returns. Remember, Sweden was neutral throughout the Holocaust. They provided white buses. Red Cross organized it. You can see the Swedish flag and the Red Cross logo on the side of the buses. I believe the convoy was about 20 buses. They arrived on April the 15th, 1945. About 423 Danish Jews were saved. We lost 53, mostly to hunger. A couple of them were shot in the process of trying to escape. And these buses, I learned later on, saved 17,000 Jewish people from many different camps. On the next slide, we have just crossed the border between Germany and Denmark. I just can't believe this picture. Look at all the people surrounding the buses. They couldn't do enough for us, welcoming us home. I was so surprised because Denmark was still occupied at that time. And they gave us candy, they gave us chocolate, sandwiches, snacks, you name it. Eventually, we ended up in Sweden. For some reason, we were not able to stay in Denmark, probably because Denmark was still occupied. We were in quarantine for about 10 days. The Swedish people wanted to make sure that we didn't bring any illness in like typhus. There was a lot of uncertainty while we were in camp. Would we be sent in transport to extermination camps? Would we get enough food to eat? Would we be shot? Or would we be able to survive? To be honest, I felt very good when we landed in Sweden, but I didn't feel completely like a free person until I returned to Denmark. We reconnected with my family in Sweden. At this time, I think it's important to convey to all of you, if you hear or when you hear other survivors speak, they will tell you most of their relatives passed during the Holocaust. In my case, we lost my father, which was very difficult. And I'm sure it was even more difficult for my mother to be a single parent. But we had family all living in Copenhagen, and they survived in Sweden. Some weeks later, it was May the 5th, 1945. On the next picture, I'm showing you a Danish flag. It was flying all over in Denmark on May the 5th, 1945. Denmark was celebrating as never before after 5 long years. We tried to celebrate in Sweden. And I may add, May the 5th is also my birthday. As a matter of fact, May the 5th, 1945, I was 10 years old. And since then, the Danish flag has been flying every May the 5th. And when I was in school and even later, I would tell anybody who would listen to me that, of course, the flag is up because of my birthday. Some weeks later, my mother and I returned to Denmark. Very difficult being without my father. Our apartment had been rented out. our personal belongings, or at least most of them, had been stored by my father's legal company. Fortunately, some friends took us in to help us get reestablished with food and clothing. And I'm often asked, as Jewish people, how were we treated when we returned? We were treated extremely well. No differentiation between the Jewish person and the Christian person. I may add that there was very little anti-Semitism at that time in Denmark. Unfortunately, it is on the rise today. So while we were Jewish people, would always be Jews, we were more recognized as Danes, and we lived integrated with non-Jewish families. There weren't any special Jewish quarters as they have in many other countries. I got some nice private lessons from a teacher. There was no official schooling in the camp, but I was able to get some private lessons in camp. Very important, those lessons, because they allowed me to join my classmates from before the Holocaust, and I would join them in 5th grade. If I had been set back 1 year, like 4th grade, which I had actually expected because of the lack of my schooling, it would have been difficult to adjust. It was difficult enough to adjust with my friends, but it helped me transform from the horrible times in camp to a more, not a more, but a normal existence in Denmark. Some years later, I graduated from high school, then commercial college. I took a job with a Danish company. Most of their products were sold outside of Denmark. When you live in a small country like Rhode Island, I wanted to see part of the world. I started in England, then I went to Canada, then United States, and I've been here since 1962. Later on, I started working for some American companies like Kraft and Sara Lee, and I worked for food companies all my life. Maybe I wanted to make sure that I would never go to bed hungry like I did just about every evening in Tærsen. The packages we received was not enough, but it saved our lives. I retired in 1999, and it's hard for me to imagine that in a few short months I've been retired for 25 years. When you get to my age, time flies. Unfortunately, the time did not fly in Tærsen. We were there 18 months, not years, and it seems such a long period, especially compared to the 25 years. I started talking to students, schools, in the fall of 2011, and I was speaking in the school. My grandson was 8 years old, and his mother, my daughter, and the teacher thought it would be a good idea to talk to those students. I was very hesitant. I had never talked to students. I didn't know how they would behave. I was hesitant because maybe they would make noises, maybe they would interrupt me, maybe they would start using their iPhones. But they showed a great deal of respect. And that became the beginning of a new career for me in education. And since then, I've spoken to over 115,000 people, mostly students. And can you imagine if each one speaks, relate the word to at least 4 people, we will have covered, I guess, about 500,000 people. I want to end the presentation with a very appropriate quote by Pastor Martin Niemöller. Some of you may be aware of it, but I think it's very appropriate for this occasion. First, they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. If we can just show the last slide, which is my website, if anybody's interested in more background information.